Emile Dillon was born in Dublin on the 21st of March 1854, son of Michael Dillon, who lived and ran an ironmonger shop at 3 Charles Street West beside the Four Courts. Emile, known as Joe to his family, first came into contact with things Russian when he acted as mass servant for Vladimir Sergeyevich Pecherin, an intellectual and sharp critic of the Tsar who converted to Catholicism and became a priest in Dublin. Emile impressed Pecherin by his knowledge of a conspiracy against the Tsar that he had read about in a book. "Someday I want to go to Russia," he told the priest. No, you are very well where you are," Pecherin knowingly replied. Emile was sent to Holy Cross College on the Clondalkin Road in Drumcondra, but his obvious lack of enthusiasm for religious studies curtailed his time there. He was 15 years of age. Adrift, he spent 3 years as a novice at St David's Monastery in Puntasaf near Holywell in North Wales. After surviving a bout of smallpox, a copy of the Life of Christ, authored by a 13th century Carthusian monk called Ludolf of Saxony, that Dillon saw in a Dublin bookshop window, inspired him to travel to La Grande Chartreuse Monastery, high up in the French Alps, in March 1872. Dillon spent almost 7 months there and at the Chartreuse de Sélignac further north, before enrolling at the Saint-Sulpice Seminary in Paris, where the Ennis-born Jean-Baptiste Hogan was director. There, Dillon was able to pursue his biblical, philosophical and philological studies to his heart's content and struck up a lifelong friendship with John O'Mahony, later president of St Finbarr's Seminary in Cork. In October 1873, Dillon left for America to study at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. But he got no further than New York, where he met the veteran Irish nationalist John Mitchell before returning to Paris the following March. Dillon never took to life in the US. Quote, "The ideas and strivings and habits being so different from my own," he wrote. Emile found work as a librarian at the Bibliothèque Nationale in the Rue Les Richelieu and took courses in Semitic languages given by the seminal biblical scholar and thinker Ernest Renan. Dillon was also strongly influenced by Abbé Alfred Loisy, another theological renegade. On the suggestion of John O'Mahony, Emile set out for the Faculty of Theology in Innsbruck in August 1874, where he studied alongside the Irish-American James Quigley, later Archbishop of Chicago, as well as O'Mahony. In June of the following year, he left for the University of Leipzig to study comparative philology, Persian and ancient Slav. After obtaining a primary degree, Dillon departed for the prestigious university at Tübingen in August 1876, adding Middle Persian, also called Zend, and Ancient Persian to the list of languages he studied. In the summer of 1877, he left Germany for Kiev, where he tutored the sons of a German-Russian family, and in 1879 he moved to St. Petersburg, where he signed up for Oriental Studies at the City University, supporting himself by giving private lessons and ghosting articles for university professors. At the same time, he wrote a number of learned books and articles under the name of Dr. E. J. von Dillon. After earning a doctorate in Oriental Languages and Literature at the University of Louvain in Belgium, Dillon was offered a chair at the University of Lyon, but he turned it down because, he wrote, "Russia had a drawing power which I could not resist." Returning to St. Petersburg, Emile became steadily more integrated into Russian society. As a member of the Slavophile Society, he gained access to the main exponents of pan-Slavist nationalism in Russia at the time. He even claimed to have been one of the pallbearers at Fyodor Dostoevsky's funeral in February 1881. And a month later, he found himself close to the scene where Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. In the same year, he married Elena Maximova Potapova, a widow who brought with her 3 daughters and her inheritance money. In a perhaps ill-advised effort to support one of his professors, Dillon wrote a review in a local newspaper that criticized the contributions of local academics to a prestigious Russian encyclopedia. This, together with Dillon's frequenting liberal circles and his criticism of Tsarist politicians, sealed Dillon's status as a persona non grata and squashed his hopes to be appointed to a teaching position at St. Petersburg University. Dillon thus decamped with his family to Kharkov, where he earned another advanced degree in 1883 and was elected to the chair of comparative philology at the City University. Alas, as in St. Petersburg, Dillon's intellectual arrogance again seems to have earned him enemies. In addition, it appears that his wayward stepdaughter, Raisa, falsely accused him of sexual abuse. Engulfed by scandal, Dillon left Kharkov for Odessa in March 1886, where he worked for local newspapers. Soon, however, Dillon returned to St. Petersburg to seek out a more reliable source of income, and he quickly accumulated well-paid freelance work for the foreign press. The greatest step up in Emile's career was probably his appointment in 1887 as special correspondent to the Daily Telegraph. Starting in 1890, Emile also contributed articles on Russian literature to a new monthly called Review of Reviews, edited by W.T. Steed. The two formed a solid professional relationship over many years until Steed went down on the Titanic in 1912. In December 1890, 14 years before another Irishman, Michael Davitt, bet the same path, Dillon stayed with Leo Tolstoy at the latter's estate in Rasnaya Polyana. Dillon translated a number of the Russians' works, while his book Leo Tolstoy, A New Portrait, was published posthumously in 1934 and provides a detailed account of the relationship Dillon developed with the literary giant. In 1892, the Daily Telegraph posted Dillon to Vienna, from where he covered international politics and came to know the Austrian Prime Minister of Irish origin, Count Edward Taaffe. While he also found the time to write another learned essay, The Origin and Language of the Primitive Bulgars. In 1894-95, he travelled to Armenia via Tbilisi to report on Turkish massacres of Christians, crossing into the Armenian lands disguised as a Cossack officer. In 1897, he again adopted a disguise, this time as an Orthodox monk, to gain access to the island of Crete, which the Ottoman authorities had banned to foreigners. Dillon subsequently embedded himself among the local insurgents and employed his linguistic abilities to act as their spokesman with foreign negotiators. In May 1899, Emile attended the Hague Peace Conference, a landmark international event, and a couple of months later he was sent by the Daily Telegraph to cover the second court-martial of Alfred Dreyfus in Rennes in western France. In 1900, Emile was sent to China to cover the Boxer Rebellion, where he almost drowned on the river Peiyou between Beijing and Tianjin. And yet, despite his onerous duties and his brush with death, Dillon found time in China to complete a metrical translation of the Hebrew poets. In 1904, Dillon had an address at 68 Fontanka in St. Petersburg, by which stage his reputation as the British press's preeminent expert on Russian politics was already established. Dillon was favourable to the tide of economic and political reform that followed the January 1905 revolution in St. Petersburg, and he was particularly close to the reformers' figurehead, Count Sergei Witte, appointed Russian Prime Minister that same year. In September 1905, Dillon accompanied Witte to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to sign the peace treaty that officially ended the Russo-Japanese War. Dillon acted as Witte's unofficial press attaché and interpreter, even lending the Russian his Waterman fountain pen for the treaty signature. However, having survived several assassination attempts and coming under increased political pressure, Witte was dismissed as Prime Minister and retired from politics altogether in August 1907. Emile Dillon was bereft, although he still had other high-ranking contacts within the Russian government, notably Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov. But the moderate reformers' cause, which was also Dillon's, suffered another serious blow when Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin was assassinated in a theatre in Kiev in 1911. In 1907, Emile travelled again to the Caucasus, where he narrowly avoided being shot himself, and then reported from the Balkans during the Bosnian crisis of 1908-1909. In Constantinople, Dillon was again able to play the amateur diplomat, thanks to his acquaintance with the Russian and Austrian foreign ministers, his Waterman pen again coming in handy when a peace treaty was signed. A workaholic, Emile grew distant from his wife Elena, culminating in their 1913 divorce. A year later, he married Kathleen Ireland from Newforge Lane in Belfast, whom he had first met when he interviewed her for a secretarial position in 1908. She was 20 years of age, Emile 54. Emile and Kathleen were in Vienna when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July 1914. They eventually managed to get back to London, where Dillon took up residence at the Claridge Hotel. In early 1916, In between assignments to various European capitals, Emile had his portrait painted by his Anglo-Irish friend William Orpen. Having lost much of his savings in Russia, and with his journalistic career in Britain entering the twilight zone, in 1920 Dillon headed for the New World, where he worked as a publicist for the Irish-American oil tycoon Edward Doheny. But a gulf formed between the two men as Dillon took an increasingly independent line on Doheny's oil interests in Mexico. Feeling as uncomfortable in the US as he did in the few months he spent in New York during his youth, Dillon turned down an apparent offer from Henry Ford to edit the tycoon's mouthpiece, the Dearborn Independent. But in Mexico, Emile's critical stance towards the US oil lobby brought him to the attention of General Álvaro Obregón, who became the country's president in 1920. Dillon travelled extensively with Obregón as a PR man, often wisely carrying a revolver, and he wrote a hagiography called President Obregón, a World Reformer, as well as a series of laudatory press articles for the US media. Tiring of Mexico, in April 1924 he and Kathleen moved to Spain, whose climate was considered ideal for Emile's failing health. And eventually they acquired a substantial house at 12 Calle Pomaret in the Sarrià district of Barcelona. Dillon died in a Barcelona clinic on the 9th of June 1933. 2 years later, Kathleen travelled to Dublin to donate the bust of her late husband by the Spanish sculptor Quaran to the Dublin Municipal Gallery and his portrait by Orpen to the National Gallery. In December 1950, a plaque was unveiled on the site of his long-demolished childhood home in Charles Street West, while in March 1954, a long article outlining his career appeared in the once prestigious Irish Times.